Thank you, Shauna. And I am absolutely delighted to welcome Bill McKibben to the Verge stage. Bill needs no introduction, but I am so thrilled to be in the position to do so. I'm going to give him one anyway. He is a prolific writer. He is a best-selling author with more than 15 books under his belt. He's also the co-founder of the climate movement 350.org, which I truly credit with creating the climate movement as its own force rather than a subsection of a broader environmental movement. It also gave permission to a generation of young people to make climate their issue. And what I truly love about Bill McKibben is that he's such an unassuming movement hero. He's this classic archetype of this reluctant hero that keeps breaking through the noise with his meticulous research and his clarity of vision and language. And in this moment where it feels like everything is falling apart, we need some clarity. So, welcome, Bill.
Well, Sarah, what a pleasure to get to join you. And you've changed clothes in just the last minute and a half because I saw you just go in just a minute ago.
Yeah, it was a hustle, but I did it.
Good work. That's what we
So,
need.
so you have been following the reality of the climate challenge as close as anyone for decades. How's it going?
Well, okay. I wrote the first book about climate change for a general audience back in 1989, before you were born, back long, long ago. And and so here's how it's gone. Everything the scientists said was going to happen has happened, and faster. Um, we were giving warnings about what would happen if we didn't do anything 30 years ago, and then we didn't do anything, and so now they've happened. So while we're talking today, there's 100,000 people evacuated from their homes in Southern California. There's the fifth hurricane of the year about to hit Louisiana. That would be Hurricane Zeta, deep into the Greek alphabet. Uh, and so I mean, this is what the world looks like with 1 degree of extra temperature, 1 degree Celsius. As you know, if we don't change things very quickly, we're headed for 3 or 3.5 degrees Celsius before you're my age. And if we do that, then we're not going to be able to have civilizations like the ones we're used to having. So right now, the next decade is the period of remaining leverage. The scientists have told us that by 2030, we need to cut emissions in half if we want to have any chance of meeting the Paris climate targets. It's too bad that we wasted the last 30 years, mostly because of the big campaign of denial that the fossil fuel industry threw up. It's bad that we have to cram 40 years worth of work into a single decade. On the other hand, the engineers have done their work. Solar and wind is now the cheapest power source on Earth. We have things like air source heat pumps and electric vehicles that we could deploy at scale fast if we wanted to. And we have built over the same 10-year period a movement that now is big enough to challenge and erode some of that power of the fossil fuel industry. That's what 350, but Extinction Rebellion and the Sunrise Movement with the Green New Deal and 10 million high school and junior high school students in Fridays for the Future and the climate strikes and things. That's what that's about. And the result is that, we see voters as they head for the polls naming climate change as the first or second most important issue this time around. We see Joe Biden over the weekend saying that climate change was not only the biggest issue for humanity, but his number one issue as he would take office. These are huge changes from even a few years ago. So, the next 10 years is going to tell the story. That's where we are. I will add one more thing, which is that 2020, hideous though it's been, has enriched that story by reminding us how closely tied it is to justice. Um, the most important thing anybody said in 2020 was what George Floyd said as he was being murdered. He said, "I can't breathe." And you can't breathe if there's a racist cop kneeling on your neck, but you can't breathe too if there's a coal-fired power plant down the road. And those, by the way, are the same communities. And you can't breathe if there's, the authorities have told you to go into your house and tape the windows shut so the wildfire smoke doesn't overwhelm you, and you can't breathe when it gets too damn hot. It was 130 degrees Fahrenheit in Death Valley, California this August, the highest reliably recorded temperature in Earth history. That's where we are right now. So it's, this is the biggest thing humans have ever done.
So over the last few years, we've seen corporations step up their climate commitments. Those on the leading edge are aiming for these climate neutrality goals at about 2030. There's a handful more looking at 2050. Are these commitments tracking with the urgency of the climate challenge, these things you're talking about now?
Well, certainly talking about 2050 at this point is, as you were pointing out, is pretty silly, um, because the actions between now and 2030, if we don't get much of the work done by 2030, then we're probably not going to get a chance, to do that much work afterwards. Things won't matter in the same ways. So the promises that people are making around the next 10 years are important. But here's what we really need more and more. I think we're coming to understand this. Think about the way in which the environmental movement first, concentrated when it first learned about climate change, about people's habits. Were you using paper towels or cloth? Were you, uh, you know, it- yes, useful and helpful, but we're not going to solve this equation that way. The numbers are too stark, the time too short, that the next, just can't make it work one vegan meal, one Tesla at a time, important as those things are. Um, Same with corporations. It's very good that people are moving to, electrify their delivery fleets and things like that. But I'll tell you, the fleet that I care about the most are the fleets of lobbyists that people deploy on Capitol Hill. And, it's time to make sure that those guys aren't spending all their time trying to get the next tax break, and to make sure that they are falling in line behind the things we need to do to have a workable planet. If we don't get something that looks a lot like the Green New Deal pretty fast, then your, electrified delivery trucks are going to be, avoiding one hurricane after one wildfire after one flood. Um, so just as individuals need, the most important thing an individual can do at this point is be less of an individual, join together with others in movements broad enough to make a difference. Really the same with corporations. For years, things like the Chamber of Commerce have gotten in the way of climate action. It would be great if they got out in front and pushed hard.
How do corporations break out of these often self created cages of shareholders and obsession with growth and desire to remain apolitical, to be taking those bold stances on the structural change you're talking about?
Well, one way they break out is when we go press them. And so we're happy to help if that's what people need. I got arrested in January in the lobby of the Chase Bank nearest Capitol Hill in DC. Jane Fonda was on the other side of the glass, egging us on. And it was because we were launching a campaign to take on the world's largest bank and the world's largest fossil fuel lender. They've lent, since the Paris Climate Accords, almost $250 billion to the fossil fuel industry, which defines irresponsible at this point in Earth's history. So the good news is that as we took them on, they began to listen and pay attention. They announced 2 weeks ago that their lending henceforth will be Paris compliant. Now, we don't yet know what that means, and I'd say it's entirely possible we may need to go back to jail before we find out precisely what it entails. But at least it's a start, and so part of that is that corporations need to realize that the pressure that's coming is very real, and I don't mean just pressure from an angry old people like me. I mean, if you want to have young people who want to go to work for you in the future, you better make sure you're on the side of the angels here, or they're not going to do it. The smartest, I mean, I just, 600 law students the top law schools in the country just signed a pledge saying they won't go to work for some of the biggest law firms in the country because these guys insist on representing the fossil fuel industry as they try to, block progress on climate change.
You just noted companies that are pledging to be, Paris compliant. Understand we still need to figure out what that means. But how can these companies tell their stories of commitments in a way that nests it into and reinforces the larger problem, which is obviously about a lot more than just that individual company, but still is, showing that there's leadership and there's steps that companies can be taking to make a difference.
Well, I think that I do think that it's most impressive when you get people cooperating across industries to tell a story together. But I also think that companies really can start to tell the story to if they really have a genuine story to tell as part of this story of their own progress towards understanding what justice and solidarity are coming to mean. I mean, we've got to move out of a world where we see, what we do in the material world, the things we buy, whatever the companies, where we see it as simply a zero sum game where companies fight with each other for to be the biggest or the best or grow the fastest or whatever. People have to understand that at this point in Earth's history and human history, uh, 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 this requires something much deeper, more profound. So I think that probably corporations would be wise to be very humble in their storytelling about all this. People have good antennae now for anything that smacks of greenwashing. They've come to understand that the more penguins there are in the ad, the more damage you're probably doing to the environment. So I would be careful of that, and I'd be serious about making contact in real ways with all the stakeholders, and especially those in the most vulnerable communities and the people who are hit the hardest.
We are about 10 months into seeing how we're dealing with one crisis, the COVID crisis. I know at the beginning of the crisis, there were lots of parallels drawn between the climate movement and what's happening with COVID and what it means for science and our response. Initially, I remember you saying that you thought it would be good for science, would be good PR for science when everybody could get on board. That doesn't seem to be the way that COVID has actually played out. Now that we're 10 months in, how do you reflect? What do you think? What lessons have we learned from how we've dealt with COVID that could be indicative to how we can deal with climate?
Well, one, I do think that a lot of people have been reminded that science is real. Yes, it's difficult when you live in a nation whose leader hasn't cottoned on to this, but November 3rd is a week away. Second, we've been reminded that working quickly pays dividends. The countries around the world that work fast and hard have gotten a lot done. And we know that that's pace is the most important variable now around climate change. Third, we really have been reminded that social solidarity matters. You know, a lot of us grew up in the political shadow of Ronald Reagan, and the idea that markets were going to solve all problems and that government was the problem and not the solution. Reagan used to say the nine scariest words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Ha ha ha. It turns out that the scariest sentences in the English language are, we've run out of ventilators, or the hillside behind your house is on fire. You can't solve those with market solutions. You solve them when you work together in order to build the kind of societies and governments that allow us to respond to truly unprecedented challenges. That's all of our job now for the years ahead.
Bill, thank you so much for joining us here today. Thank you for your leadership. And back to you, Shauna.